with Dennis Pierce. He's president of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, BLE, as in Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, dash T, as in Trainmen, .org, BLE-T.org. Twitter at Teamsters. And President Pierce, welcome to the program. Great to have you with us. Tell us how the railroads have been cutting you guys, and your workers in 16 ways to study. It seems like this even has some relation to the supply chain problems that we're having.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Tom. You're right. It does all tie together. The railroad started slashing employees probably in the last 5 or 6 years. It actually started pre-pandemic, and they eliminated upwards of a third of their workforce. They mothballed locomotives. It was all a profit-based scheme, and it worked. They made billions. They've all reported record profits since they adopted these fewer people doing more work, longer, fewer trains. And they put a lot of people out on the street, and then they expected the rest of them that were still there to pick up the slack and do extra work, all the while through a pandemic and a contract negotiation that's carried on for almost 3 years.
Whoa. To what extent is this the result of consolidation in the rail industry? I know, back 20, 30 years ago, there were dozens of railroad companies, most of them regional all around the United States. I understand we're down to like 7 now, and there's 2 of them that are trying to merge.
Yeah, you basically got 2 big railroads in the West, Union Pacific and BNSF. The East is dominated by Norfolk Southern CSX. You've then got KCS trying to merge with Canadian Pacific, and Canadian National is the other player. But you're right, in the regions they run to, if you're a captive shipper, you rely on that almost monopoly, if not a duopoly, in your part of the country to get ships or shipments to you by rail. So,
in this proposed merger, I'm assuming that you guys are participating in speaking out against it. I would guess. Is the Biden administration looking at antitrust violations at all here, or any effort to maybe even break up some of these monopolies?
I don't think there's any effort to break them up. The Surface Transportation Board is obviously in the process of considering the merger. Our goal, if this does go through, is to protect our employees at the common locations, because mergers often result in fewer jobs. So we're at the table early, even before notices can be served or before the STB has approved the merger, to start those conversations. Many of the railroads have jumped in, many other shippers, both pro and con, which is normal when 2 railroads try to merge. But there hasn't been a merger like this probably since the 90s. So jury's out on how the STB will look at this.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. We're talking with Dennis Pierce, the president of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. If I have this right, you represent about 115,000 workers. Is there a possibility of a strike, and what might that mean for the country?
Well, our organization, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, represents roughly 33,000 active. Of that group, 23,000 of them are in this bargaining group that collectively, 12 unions, represents about 115,000 people affected by the contract.
Okay.
Hang on. We've been at the table for 2.5 years. We went through mediation. We ultimately, as a group, ended up being released from mediation. The Railway Labor Act is very unique for the unions and their employees that work under it. And then we went into a cooling off period last week. The Biden administration had appointed a presidential emergency board to hear the dispute, which is one of the final steps in the process. So both sides made their case to that panel last week, and we expect them to make a recommendation roughly around the 15th of August.
And at what point might your and the other unions be looking at the possibility of a strike vote?
Once that panel puts out its recommendation, it starts another 30-day cooling off period. At the end of that cooling off period, both parties, and I think it's important to note, not only could the unions strike if there is no contract reach, but the railroads could also lock us out. They get the right to self-help, and that's one of the options they have, and they've done it before. I was here in 1991 when it happened. They did that to push it to the government. Once that cooling off period ends, the really only government agency, government body that could step in and stop a strike or a lockout is the United States Congress. They would pass a law that would either implement the recommendations of the panel, which is what happened in 1991, or they would come up with some other way to try to craft a settlement for the parties. In most cases, you look at Congress, And you wonder, do they want to jump into this deep? It's an election year for Congress. Obviously, as you said at the beginning, this is a huge, the impact of the supply chain is on everyone's mind. Nobody set out to try to make the supply chain any more messed up than it really is. But that 30-day cooling off period would end about the middle of September. And that would be the first opportunity if there was going to be any type of action taken by either side.
Tell me about the impact of this multi-year shedding of employees and consolidation of trains and whatnot that you mentioned when we first opened the conversation. How does that impact the average worker, the average person in your union?
Well, as part of their employee cutting, many of these railroads adopted attendance policies that force people to put it in most common terms, pick up extra shifts, work overtime. In our world, they just make us go to work more often. Our guys are on rotating call boards. They go to work when their turn comes, but by shedding employees, they raise the expectation of how many times those folks should have to go to work. As a result, the BNSF model in and of itself, over 1,000 employees left the industry because they just didn't want to work that much. So yeah, the policies that they've adopted have all been to get more work out of fewer employees. At the same time, the customer service has completely gone in the tank. The Surface Transportation Board's been holding hearings, trying to figure out why the shippers can't get their products. And it all ripples to this management style that really doesn't seem to care about anything but profit.
It's fairly obvious what the effects of a strike would be in terms of the supply chain, but to what extent over the last year or three have these cuts by the railroads themselves in your employees had an impact on the supply chain? To what extent is the supply chain, even right now, somewhat crippled by the problems that you're experiencing as a result of this style of management?
Well, I think it's a huge impact. On any given day, there are 20 to 30 trains parked without crews or locomotives to run them that are full of the containers coming off the ships in Los Angeles that can't get to Chicago or returning.
Whoa.
So
that's a lot.
Yeah, and it's not just the West roads. The East roads are experiencing the same thing. And that's why the shippers are so upset, is that there's no predictability on when the products will arrive that need to get on the store shelves.
Yeah, and this is not a decision made by you or your union members. This is a decision made by the railroads themselves. How do they explain themselves to Congress or to their customers, frankly? I guess if you're a monopoly, you can just tell your customers to take a hike, right?
That seems to be the backbone of their position. They've gone before the Surface Transportation Board. They were called on the carpet there, and they've tried to make excuses. They've tried to say, we're trying to hire. Nobody wants to work. I did a little research on that phrase. It started in about the 1930s when a capitalistic group didn't think people wanted to work for what they were willing to pay or how they would treat them. They then accused that nobody wants to work.
Right.
They're having a hard time hiring because word is out on the street as to how they get treated if you do go to work for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I am hearing that through the grapevine a lot. Dennis Pierce, the president of, Sean, the president of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, BLE-T.org. The Twitter at Teamsters. President Pierce, thanks a lot for dropping by today. Great talking with you.
Thank you, Tom.
My pleasure. My pleasure.